Mr. Robert Williams was a man everyone admired and feared at the same time, a millionaire CEO who seemed larger than life, carrying the weight of his empire on his shoulders without showing a sign of weakness, at least not to the world that constantly watched him. His board members praised his sharp mind, his assistants admired his discipline, and even his rivals whispered about how unstoppable he seemed. But hidden beneath his polished image were cracks that no one cared to notice, cracks that revealed themselves only in quiet, lonely moments when the hallways emptied and the lights of the office glowed against the night sky. And it was in those moments that James, the black janitor who worked the late shifts, observed what others dismissed. He had no title, no expensive suit, no seat at the table, yet he had eyes that noticed, a heart that remembered, and a conscience that refused to look away. And what he saw troubled him deeply, for every evening, as he pushed his cart past the executive office, he caught glimpses of Robert leaning back in his chair, rubbing his chest with a troubled hand, his breathing heavier than before, sweat shining on his forehead even when the air conditioning was running cold. But whenever someone entered the room, Robert straightened himself and forced a smile, hiding his discomfort behind the mask of strength. And the others, too eager to please him, or too afraid to ask questions, said nothing, assuming their powerful boss was simply tired from long hours. James, however, could not convince himself so easily, because the signs echoed memories that never left him. Memories of his father, who used to cough late at night and brush it off as just tiredness until one day it was too late. And that loss had left a scar in James's heart, a scar that made him sensitive to small details others ignored. So every time he saw Robert gripping the edge of his desk a little too tightly or pausing for breath after walking across the room, unease grew inside him. And though his duty was only to sweep, mop, and empty trash bins, he felt an invisible weight pressing down on him, whispering that he could not stay silent forever. One evening, as James polished the floor outside the conference room, he noticed Robert stumble ever so slightly when stepping into the elevator. The kind of stumble most people would dismiss as clumsiness, but James's chest tightened because he recognized it as something more. Yet when the assistants behind Robert laughed and carried on their conversations without concern, he said nothing, his broom trembling in his hands as he silently prayed. He was wrong, though deep down he feared he was right. Each night he tried to push away the worry, telling himself it wasn't his place, telling himself no one would listen to a janitor. But every time Robert appeared with that pale look on his face or that shortness of breath in his steps, James's guilt grew, and he felt trapped between silence and duty, between being invisible and being brave, between the world that ignored him and the voice inside that told him to act. The tension inside him built slowly, day after day, until it felt like he was carrying a secret no one else could see. And the more he noticed, the harder it became to look away, because Robert's symptoms were not fading, they were worsening, and the clock seemed to be ticking toward something inevitable. One night, as James emptied a trash bin from Robert's office, he saw the CEO hunched over his desk, his tie loosened, his face pale, a trembling hand pressed against his chest, and for a brief second their eyes met, Robert quickly sitting up, straight, forcing a weak smile, pretending everything was fine, but James saw the truth in his eyes, the flicker of pain, the silent plea for relief that pride refused to admit. And as James stepped out of the office, his heart pounded louder than ever before, because he knew these were no ordinary signs. He knew he was watching a man walking closer to danger each passing day, and he also knew that if he continued to stay silent, he might soon witness the kind of tragedy he once lived through with his father. Yet the question burned inside him like fire. Would anyone believe the warning if it came from him, a janitor whose words were rarely heard, or would they laugh, dismiss, and ignore, leaving the truth buried until it was too late? James could not escape the thoughts that kept returning to him each night after work, as if the weight of what he had seen in Robert's face had followed him home and refused to let him rest. Because when he lay on his narrow bed in his small apartment, he kept hearing the faint sound of Robert's uneven breathing echoing in his memory, and he saw again the moment the proud CEO had tried to cover his chest pain with a forced smile. A smile that convinced everyone else but not him. James knew what he had seen was not something to ignore, yet he also knew his place in the world was not one where his words carried weight, for he was only a janitor, invisible in the background, a man who pushed his cart quietly so that others could walk on polished floors, a man whose presence was often unnoticed except when his absence made the trash pile up. And the thought of speaking up filled him with fear, because he could already hear the laughter, the doubt, the way people would raise their eyebrows and say, "What does a janitor know about health? He should stick to cleaning floors." But no matter how many times he tried to silence the voice of doubt inside, another voice, softer yet stronger, reminded him of his father, who had coughed for months while everyone around him dismissed it as nothing serious until the night he collapsed and never stood again. And James, as a young boy, had cried beside his father's bed, wondering if things could have been different if someone had spoken sooner, if someone had cared enough to notice the warnings. And now those same signs were appearing in front of him again. This time on a man whose wealth and power fooled everyone into believing he was unbreakable. The irony burned in James's chest, for Robert's office was filled with people who had the knowledge, the access, and the authority to act. Yet none of them saw what he saw, or perhaps they chose not to, blinded by their fear of questioning the man they worked for, and so the burden settled heavier on James's shoulders, as if fate itself was testing whether he had learned from his past or whether he would allow history to repeat itself. In the following days, he observed Robert even more closely, trying to reassure himself, but instead, he found new reasons to worry. Because during meetings, he noticed Robert rubbing his temples more often, his voice growing hoarse, his movements slower, his patience shorter, and though his assistants whispered about stress, James recognized the fragility hidden behind the mask of confidence, and it frightened him to think that Robert, a man with so much influence, might fall without warning while surrounded by people too blind to see the truth. One afternoon, as James was wiping down the glass doors, he overheard two executives joking about Robert's overwork, saying he was like a machine that never stopped. And though their words were meant as praise, James felt his hands clench around the cloth, for he knew machines broke down too, often without a second chance. And when the executives passed by, without even glancing at him, James felt that familiar sting of invisibility, the reminder that he lived in a world where his warnings could as easily be drowned out by the sound of more powerful voices. Still, he could not shake the feeling that if he stayed silent, he would carry the guilt forever. So he tried to gather courage, rehearsing in his mind how he might approach Robert or perhaps one of the assistants. But each time he pictured the scene, his confidence collapsed, replaced by the image of them laughing at him, dismissing him, or worse, reporting him for stepping out of his role. Yet the thought of silence was unbearable, because every night the fear grew stronger, like a shadow that stretched longer and darker with each passing day. And he knew that sooner or later, something would happen that could not be undone. One evening, as he pushed his cart down the corridor, he paused outside Robert's office and heard a heavy cough from inside, followed by the sound of a chair scraping the floor, and his instincts told him to go in, to ask if everything was all right, but his hand froze on the door, his heart pounding as the war inside him raged on. Should he risk his dignity and possibly his job to speak, or should he keep quiet and let fate take its course? And in that moment, James realized that his silence was not simply about fear. It was about the value of his voice in a world that rarely listened to men like him. And yet he also knew that sometimes the smallest voice, if spoken at the right time, could be the one that mattered most. But still he hesitated, caught between the safety of silence and the danger of truth, unaware that every second he delayed was bringing Robert closer to the edge, and himself closer to a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The night was stormy, rain beating against the tall glass windows of the building as if the sky itself wanted to warn the people inside of what was about to come. And James, pushing his cart slowly along the polished floors, felt a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the weather, because deep inside he sensed that the moment he had feared and dreaded was drawing near, and when he reached the corner that led to Robert's office, he froze, hearing the sound of a chair crashing to the ground, followed by a groan that chilled his blood, and without thinking, he rushed forward, his mop clattering against the wall as he pushed open the half-closed door. And there he saw the mighty CEO, the man who commanded boardrooms and signed deals worth millions, hunched over his desk, his face pale, his shirt sticking to his skin with sweat, his hand clutching his chest as if an invisible force was squeezing the life out of him. And for a brief second, Robert looked up, his eyes wide with fear, trying to wave James away, whispering with a broken voice that it was nothing, just stress. But James saw the truth. He saw the trembling in his fingers, the way his lips turned faintly blue, the way each breath seemed harder to pull in. And in that instant he knew this was no ordinary discomfort. This was danger. This was the very moment he had been waiting for and dreading at the same time. The moment where his silence could destroy a life or his voice could save it. And though his heart thundered with fear of being dismissed, he stepped forward, his voice shaking but firm as he said, "Sir, this is not stress. These are signs of something serious. You need a doctor now." And for the first time in his career, James looked directly into Robert's eyes without lowering his head, without retreating, and his words, though simple, carried a weight that broke through the wall of pride Robert had built around himself. For Robert wanted to argue, to tell the janitor he was fine, but his body betrayed him with another sharp pain that made him gasp. And in that weakness he saw the raw sincerity in James's face, a man who had nothing to gain by speaking, nothing to prove, yet cared enough to risk everything just to say the truth. And the silence between them was filled with the storm outside, thunder crashing as if urging the decision, and Robert, humbled by his own fragility, finally nodded, whispering, "Call someone," his voice barely audible, and James, without hesitation, reached for the phone on the desk, his hands trembling but steady enough to dial for help, every second feeling like an eternity as he explained the emergency, his voice rising with urgency until the receptionist on the other end promised an ambulance was on its way. Meanwhile, James stayed by Robert's side, pulling a chair close, urging him to stay awake, to breathe slowly, to not give in to the heaviness pulling him down. And the sight of the janitor, the man who had always been invisible, sitting there, with a calm determination, struck Robert in ways he could not yet explain. Because in that moment, the CEO, who was always in control of others, was now placing his life in the hands of someone the world rarely noticed. And the irony pressed down on him as heavily as the pain in his chest. James's mind raced with memories of his father, and every second felt like a chance to rewrite the past. To do for Robert what no one had done for his own family. And though fear lingered, courage burned stronger. Because he understood now that real courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. And as the sirens grew louder in the distance, James held on to that thought, whispering encouragements, refusing to let silence or doubt steal another life. And when the paramedics finally burst through the door, their equipment rattling, their voices commanding, James stepped back, his heart still pounding, his uniform damp with sweat, yet his eyes fixed on Robert as they lifted him onto the stretcher. And in that fleeting moment before the CEO was carried away, their eyes met again, and Robert, through the haze of pain and fear, gave a faint nod of gratitude. A silent acknowledgement that the janitor's courage had just changed everything. And as the ambulance doors closed and the sirens faded into the stormy night, James stood alone. In the empty office, the overturned chair still lying on the floor, his cart forgotten in the hallway, and though his hands trembled and his knees felt weak, a strange calm washed over him. For he knew he had done the right thing, and that single moment of courage, born out of fear, compassion, and memory, had drawn a line between life and death. The ambulance tore through the stormy night with flashing lights painting the wet streets red and white. And inside the vehicle, Robert lay strapped to the stretcher, his chest rising and falling unevenly. As the paramedics worked quickly, placing wires on his skin, speaking in clipped voices, and inserting an oxygen mask over his face. And though Robert had lived a life of control, where every detail was managed by his decisions, in that moment he was powerless, watching his own body betray him. And the image of James's steady eyes returned again and again, reminding him that it was not his board members, not his assistants, not even his family, but the janitor who had forced him to face the truth before it was too late. Meanwhile, James stood outside the hospital minutes later, soaked by the rain, watching as the stretcher disappeared through the wide emergency doors. And though the doctors had assured him that he had done the right thing by acting quickly, his heart still raced with doubt, fearing that maybe he had been too late. Maybe his courage had come at the last possible moment, and he waited in the cold hallway with wet shoes and trembling hands, watching nurses rush by with charts and stretchers, listening to the hum of machines and the echo of hurried footsteps, every sound reminding him how fragile life truly was. Inside the operating room, the doctors discovered Robert's condition was far worse than anyone had believed. His arteries nearly blocked, his heart on the verge of shutting down, and while the machines beeped urgently, one doctor muttered that, if Robert had waited even another day, he might not have survived. A statement that would later echo in Robert's mind like a haunting reminder of how close he had been to losing everything. As the hours dragged on, James sat in a corner of the waiting area, ignored by most of the staff who assumed he was simply a bystander with no real connection. But in truth, he was the reason the CEO was fighting for another chance. And the thought filled him with both relief and fear. Because what if, despite his efforts, Robert did not make it? What if all he could say later was that he had tried, and the uncertainty gnawed at him until he pressed his face into his hands, and whispered prayers he had not spoken since his childhood, asking God to give Robert another day, not because he admired him as a powerful man, but because no human deserved to leave the world unseen, and no family deserved to lose someone. Without warning, after what felt like an eternity, the doors of the emergency room opened, and a doctor emerged, his face weary but carrying a faint smile, announcing that Robert was stable, the surgery had been successful, and he was now resting under close observation. And James exhaled so deeply that he felt the weight of the past weeks lift from his chest, tears stinging his eyes, though he quickly brushed them away. Because in that moment he realized he had not only saved a life, but also confronted his own fear of being invisible. His voice had mattered, his courage had made a difference. When Robert finally awoke hours later, groggy and weak, his first thought was confusion at the tubes and machines surrounding him. But then his eyes fell on the corner of the room where James sat quietly, his uniform still damp, his posture humble, yet unshaken, and Robert blinked slowly, realizing the truth he had never considered before, that wealth, power, and status meant nothing in the face of mortality, and that sometimes the greatest acts of salvation came not from those in high positions but from those the world often ignored. And his throat tightened with emotion he could not express fully, but he whispered hoarsely, You saved me." And James, lowering his head with quiet respect, replied softly, "I only did what anyone should have done." Yet deep inside, both men knew it was more than that. Because James had noticed what no one else had, and he had spoken when silence was easier. As the news of Robert's condition spread through the company, the employees were stunned, not only because their invincible boss had nearly died, but also because the man who had prevented it was the janitor they had overlooked for years. And whispers filled the halls as people began to see James in a new light. No longer just the quiet figure with a mop, but the man whose courage had changed everything. For Robert, the days of recovery were filled with reflection, every heartbeat reminding him how close he had come to losing everything, and every glance at James reminding him of the truth he had ignored for so long, that every life, every voice, carried value, no matter how the world ranked it. Lying in his hospital bed, Robert thought of his family, of the empire he had built, of the people who depended on him, and a deep gratitude washed over him, because he realized that all of it would have vanished had it not been for one moment of courage from someone most people did not even notice, and he vowed silently that when he returned to his office, things would never be the same again. For James, the experience was life-changing as well, because he had carried the weight of his father's loss for years. But now, for the first time, he felt he had redeemed that memory, that he had broken the cycle of silence, and in saving Robert, he had also saved a part of himself that had long been burdened by regret. As the rain finally eased outside, and the first rays of dawn broke through the hospital windows, painting the halls in pale gold, James rose from his chair and looked at Robert resting peacefully, his breathing steady, and though exhaustion pulled at his body, he felt lighter than he had in years, knowing that the choice he made in a single moment had altered the course of another man's life, proving that sometimes the greatest heroes were the ones no one saw coming. The days that followed Robert's surgery were unlike any he had ever known, because, for the first time in decades, the man who had built empires, closed impossible deals, and led armies of employees into success was forced to lie still, his body fragile, his thoughts restless, and as he stared at the ceiling of the hospital room, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the machines, he found himself thinking less about the millions in his accounts and more about the one man who had refused to stay silent when it mattered most, the janitor whose eyes had seen what everyone else ignored. And though Robert's pride had once made him believe he needed no one, the truth now sat heavy in his chest. He owed his life not to his wealth or his power, but to the courage of a man most people would have walked past without a second glance. During those quiet hours of recovery, James often came by, sometimes to check if he needed water, sometimes to just sit silently in the corner. And though he never spoke much, his presence carried a weight that Robert had never felt from any of his executives, because here was a man who did not want anything from him, who had no agenda, no ambition tied to his name. Only a simple honesty that came from the heart, and it humbled Robert more than any defeat in business ever had. So one morning when the doctors confirmed that his condition was improving and that he would soon be allowed to return home, Robert asked that the company staff gather in the main hall once he returned to the office. A request that puzzled everyone but was obeyed without question. A week later, when he walked slowly into the building, supported by his family, in the eyes of hundreds of employees, there was a hush in the air, for many of them had not seen him since the night of his collapse, and whispers ran through the crowd about how the indestructible CEO had been brought down by his own body. But what silenced them even more was when Robert paused in the center of the hall, his voice softer than usual but filled with a gravity that made everyone lean in, and he said, "A life is not measured by how high you stand above others, but by the people who stand beside you when you stumble. And I am standing here today because one man dared to speak when no one else did." And with that, he turned, beckoning James to step forward. And the crowd gasped as the janitor, dressed in his plain uniform, walked hesitantly through the sea of expensive suits and polished shoes, his head bowed slightly, unsure of why he had been called, until Robert placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "This man saved my life, not because it was his duty, not because it was his job, but because he saw me as a human being when everyone else saw only a title." And the hall was silent, the kind of silence that carried more weight than applause. And in that silence, James felt something he had never known before, not invisibility, not dismissal, but recognition, the kind that went beyond words. And for the first time in his life he realized his voice had power. Robert continued, his words firm despite the weakness in his body, telling the staff that every person in the company mattered, from the ones in the boardroom to the ones who cleaned the floors, and that no act of kindness or courage was too small to change the course of someone's life. And as he spoke, many of the employees lowered their heads, ashamed of how they had treated James as if he were unseen, while others looked at him with new respect, realizing that the man they once passed by without thought had become the reason their leader was alive. For James, the moment was overwhelming, his heart pounding as he stood in front of people who had never looked his way before. But in that instant he felt no bitterness, only gratitude, because he knew that what mattered was not their recognition, but the truth that he had done the right thing when it counted, and that truth filled him with a quiet strength. Later, as the hall emptied and Robert returned to his office with slower steps than before, he called James in privately and said, "You reminded me of something I had forgotten, that life is fragile, and no amount of success can protect us." from it, but compassion, courage, and human connection can save us. And those words stayed with James like a fire in his chest, warming him in ways he could not explain. For he had not only saved a man's life, but also awakened a part of himself that believed every person, no matter how unseen, had the power to make a difference. That night, as he walked home beneath a sky now cleared of storm clouds, the city lights shimmering above the wet streets, James felt lighter than he ever had before, knowing that his father's memory had found peace through his actions, that he had broken the silence which once cost him dearly, and though the world might still see him as a janitor, he knew the truth. The smallest voice, when spoken with courage, could echo louder than the roar of 1,000 powerful men, and in saving Robert, he had also saved himself, proving that humanity, at its core, was never about wealth or power, but about the connection that bound one life to another in the most unexpected and extraordinary ways.